I am so excited to introduce our newest choir project, What Happens When a Woman, composed by Alexandra Olsavsk of the Artemisia Trio and performed here in a virtual choir video by a special group of 20 girls and women. This group, which includes singers from our UUCR choir and invited guests, came together this summer on Zoom to learn this powerful song and create this piece of music for us. In addition to our beloved and committed choir members, Cheryl Harlan, Tracy Hedges, Kara Fortner, Wendy Katz, Lisa Gunderman, and Linda Johnson, you will see new faces. They include Jojo Di Paolo, who began attending UUCR services only this spring on Zoom. So she has not had the opportunity to meet many of you yet, but she jumped right into this project. In fact, she appears as the very first singer in the video with the powerful stomp of her foot. There are also a few members of my women's a cappella ensemble, Bella Voce. You may recognize some of them as Bella Voce has performed for UUCR twice this year, once in person and once virtually. 3 of us in Bella Voce have daughters who love to sing, and I was so happy they also joined this project. Thank you so much to my Bella Voce friends, Christy Meacham, Kate Kelly, Molly Stevenson, and Deanne Phillips, and to our 3 Bella Voce daughters, Gabby Young, Michaela Fenn, and Anna Phillips Brown. There is a moment in the video when you will see the faces of the mothers and the daughters paired together on the screen. One of the many personal and creative touches designed by our truly wonderful video editor, Jessie Leong. The concept of this project was also to celebrate and highlight how the voices of girls can be as powerful as the voices of women in making change in the world. Girls like Ruby Bridges, Greta Thunberg, and Malala Yousafzai. I wanted this project to be intergenerational. So you will see some younger faces too that you will not recognize. These are 4 girls and young women who have studied voice with me. I would like to thank them. The sisters Akile and Tinawe Apiu from Burkina Faso, and Isabella Galinsky and Andy Cass from Arlington. Lastly, thank you to my friend, the wonderful singer Amber Godfrey, who recorded her video from her Manhattan apartment while packing to move to Thailand. I want to thank all of these singers from the bottom of my heart for joining this very special project. Please enjoy What Happens When a Woman.
Wasn't that just incredible? So beautiful and so wonderful to see all our people and all those diverse people who joined with us. Thank you so much to Cynthia for all the work on that, and Jesse for your incredible editing, and for all. And we will be posting that video on YouTube so you can pass it on to your friends. So for the homily, I think I've talked about before, I have been a feminist since I first discovered the second wave of the women's movement when I was a sophomore in high school. My 16-year-old boyfriend at the time gave me a copy of Shirley Chisholm's autobiography as a birthday present for my 16th birthday, and I became a rabid fan. She was my first real life heroine, and I devoured everything I could about her. At 16, I decided I was going to be a congresswoman, and I began laying out my plans to serve on the local city youth council, which I did for 2 years. I became a government major in college. I planned to intern in Congress, go to law school, and eventually run for public office. You probably know that I got as far as interning in Congress before I was called to my life's work in sexuality education and justice. I took women's studies in college, and I gobbled up the history of women that I had never learned before. Those of you who are about my age may remember that we renamed history as Her Story. Do you remember that? Abigail Adams. Remember finding out about Abigail Adams was a revelation. In a letter dated March 31st, 1776, she wrote to her husband, John, who would become president, urging him and the other members of the Continental Congress to remember the ladies. Her letter, and I'm quoting, said, "By the way, in this new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you to remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and we will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." Go, Abigail. I gobbled up stories about how women won the vote. Women were not given the vote, they won the vote. And the biographies of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Carrie Chapman Catt, and Susan B. Anthony. In 1998, I was thrilled to attend the annual convening of the National Women's Hall of Fame in Seneca Falls, where I accepted the honor bestowed on Mary Calderon, the founder of SICUS, the organization I led for 12 years, as she was inducted into the Hall of Fame. The other inductees that day included Madeleine Albright and Eunice Shriver, so it was quite an experience to be celebrated with them, even as I was just a substitute. So imagine the remorse I have felt these past few weeks to learn how much of the history I so excitedly learned erased the contributions of women of color to women's rights and to women's right to vote. I was surprised just 3 days ago. I was this age when I learned that American women never used the term suffragette. Only their detractors did. The E-T-E, added to the end of suffrage was designed by British newspapers to belittle the women's movement for voting, and adopted by US newspapers to do the same. And so we have all learned this week to say suffragist, not suffragette, and I hope I get it right. So as you know, this past Tuesday, we celebrated the passage of the 19th Amendment. And for far too long, my friends, we have understood that that day in 1920 meant that women now had the right to vote. Yet millions of women remained unenfranchised after 1920. Black women, Mexican American women, Native American women, and Chinese American women. This is a picture of Mabel Ping Hua Lee, who was a suffragist who led thousands of women in a 1912 parade in Boston for women's right to vote. Yet she herself could not vote in 1920 because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Many Native Americans were not considered citizens until 1924. It wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that Black people in the South had their right to vote affirmed. And as Linda told you, many people of color and some Unitarian Universalists died fighting for the right to vote. The American historian Rosalind Terburg Penn, who died in 2018, uncovered stories of more than 100 influential Black suffragists in the US, whose work goes back to the beginning of not the 20th, but the 19th century. This photo is of the Women's National Baptist Convention, which was advocating for women's suffrage in 1910. I know you've heard of Sojourner Truth and her stirring address, Ain't I a Woman? But do you know the names Mary Ann Shadd Cary, who was the first Black woman to edit a newspaper? Or Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who Linda introduced you to, a member of the Unitarian Church in Philadelphia, who in 1866 argued at the American Equal Rights meeting that our destinies as women, quote, Black and white, rich and poor, are all bound up together, and that racism had to become a white woman's issue. She said, and I quote, "You white women speak here of rights, I speak of wrongs." You know the name of Harriet Tubman, but did you know that she advocated for the right of women to vote? Or how about the stories of African abolitionists and suffragists, Mary Stuart, Harriet Purvis, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Adela Hunt Logan, Adelina Otero Warren, Mary Church Terrell, and there are many more. And I have promised myself it is time for me to learn more about their stories and their contributions. I hope you will too. This past week, the first sculpture of women figures was revealed in Central Park. Up until this week, there had been no women depicted in a Central Park monument. I was thrilled to learn that one of my classmates at Wesleyan, Meredith Bergman, was the sculptor of this monument. And here's some of what Meredith has said. "We need statues of real women in Central Park. We need to be true to our new understanding of the historical record, which does not shrink from calling out injustice and oppression, or minimize the contributions of people of color or the harm done to people of color. We need to correct the injustice done to women of all races and their invisibility in public spaces. We need to commemorate an important landmark in the so far endless struggle for justice in America, without forgetting that had America been true to its founding principles, movements for equal rights would never have been necessary. None of the women depicted on my monument lived to see the ratification of the 19th Amendment, let alone the Voting Rights Act of 1965, whose work is still incomplete. But as we struggle towards greater justice, we need and deserve a monument commemorating some of the important work that has come before us." So my friends, it is important for us to recast the struggle for voting rights as not something that happened 100 years ago, but as something that demands our attention right now. I think, as you know, in 2013, the Supreme Court of the United States handed down a 5-4 decision that effectively gutted many of the key provisions of the Civil Rights Act, freeing states to change their election laws without advance federal approval. As the New York Times special section on the 19th Amendment said last week, the fight for suffrage is the fight for equality, and it isn't over. Far from it. The Unitarian Universalist Association has been in the forefront of efforts to protect the vote for all. I'm going to show you a short video on the UU the Vote efforts, grounded in our 5th principle, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. UCR has been very active in UU the Vote under the shared leadership of Terry Grogan, Lainey Nazare, and Marcia Hughes Reese, and I'm grateful for all they have done. Starting in May, they began a series of weekly asks to the congregation to take specific, nonpartisan actions as part of this campaign to fight voter suppression and to encourage robust voting this year. Since then, 38 of you have mailed almost 1,400 postcards to voters whose registration may be endangered by voter suppression. And we are in the midst of preparing to send another 1,400. I hope that even more of you will get involved in this effort in the coming weeks, including phone banking and texting. Terry wrote me, quote, "In the next 2 months, we will be working with the regional UUSJ campaign to do even more, especially to encourage early voting and get out the vote efforts." It is now less than 65 days until the national and state elections. I know I don't need to remind this congregation to register, to sign up for your absentee or mail-in ballot, to have a plan to vote if you don't think it will be safe to vote in person. I hope you're talking to your young adult children and to your elderly parents about the importance of voting. We must honor the people who died, who gave us the right to vote with our votes and our activism. And my friends, let me remind you that no matter what happens on November 3rd, our work for justice will not be over. Regardless of who wins, we will need to continue to raise our voices, to organize, to assure that the promise of America finally becomes real for everyone. As Michelle Obama said, we must vote because, quote, "You cannot take your freedom for granted. Just like the generations who have come before you, you have to do your part to preserve and protect these freedoms. You may not always have a comfortable life, and you may not always be able to solve all of the world's problems at once. But don't ever underestimate the importance you have, because history has shown us that courage can be contagious and that hope can take on a life of its own. May our courage be contagious. May our hope take on a life of its own. So may it be."